Hi everyone, I want to welcome you to the Society of Multicultural Architects and Designers, our symposium with Stealth Architects. This lecture fits into our symposium this year as we continue to look at architects as activists. Our first event, which was the Professor Dialogues, focused on how architects can be and will continue to be activists through helping to make architecture accessible to the less fortunate communities, and how we can collaborate with other disciplines and people to use the true power of design. Dzokic and Marc Neelen will continue this concept by exploring what the possible scope of involvement of architecture can be towards a shared creation of urban space.
Thank you, Alex. As a faculty advisor to SMART, I just want to thank the students for a fantastic job in putting the series together and making this event possible. It's a real privilege to have a pair of bright and wonderful people like Anna and Marc here with us. Especially, I've been reflecting a lot about the name Stealth. So it's not bad to have somebody who's designed to be under the radar to be here with us. So I'm really happy that our radar picked you up and that you're here. Anna and Marc divide their work between Rotterdam and Belgrade. And I think that's significant. I'm sure you're going to be talking about it a little bit more later on, but there couldn't be in the contemporary condition more extreme differentiation between an extremely planned country from top to bottom to every stream as is Netherlands, and so much in the radar of architectural discourse, as opposed to Belgrade that after the collapse of the regime, the state disappeared and has, together with the whole Balkan Peninsula, gone through a process of transformation, not only through the war, but after the war in terms of what it means to the collapse of the institutions, the way in which cities have developed and grown. And I think it's a fantastic thing that they be able to maintain attention to both worlds, especially in a moment where we as a profession seem to be focused on what the politicians would call follow the trail of the money. Follow the money trail, and then that will tell you what's important today. There are all these other processes and events that are taking place around the world that they seem to be very keen to be tapping into and looking into, redefine what the profession is and what can be and what processes or what techniques, methods, forms of interventions can the profession generate to create public space. And that sounds like a simple, but I think it's a very complex, and in many ways, the labor of a lot of reflection and creativity, how they present themselves both as architects, researchers, curators, planners, mappers. I'm not very good at reading many different things, but I would read a couple of things. It says that their practice is based between Rotterdam and Belgrade. Stealth shape opportunities where various fields of investigation meet, and we're thinking about possible futures of the city are mobilized. And I think that's the possible futures of the city, together with some of their initiatives that are too long to read, but one of the schools that they co-initiated is the School of Missing Studies. And I think that's a fantastic term for a school and one that we should adopt ourselves. Those things that are not under the radar of mainstream and that we as architects have the obligation to map, discover, and give legitimacy to that presence. They've been curators of many exhibitions, of many events. They work both in self-initiated research, projects that are by commission. They've been the curators of the Dutch Pavilion in the Venice Biennale in 2008, where they look at the work of the schools of architecture in the Netherlands and the production of it. Last year, I was lucky enough to be invited by them to Albania, to the Biennale in Tirana, that for the first time had a component on architecture. And it was an incredible discovery for me to discover or to realize the amount of research, work, activism, political awareness, and intellectual sophistication that seems to be emerging from that region in the world, and all facilitated and I think agglutinated as a catalytic through Anna and Marc. I couldn't escape the temptation to talk about the name stealth, because with all these different operations, the very public, you imagine that you would call yourself a stealth. It's a very interesting mode of operation. It has to do both with, as you know, being under the radar. These famous planes have the most sophisticated technology to perform the most invisible of options, which is to be able to be constantly invisible and yet always present. I think that defines your work very well. And I will finish with an anecdote that they told me about their name, about a stealth plane that was down during the war in the Balkans. It fell down into a field. It was dismembered very quickly, I'm sure. The engines were to Russia. The technology came back to the States. But the fuselage that has the surface was actually gotten by the Aviation Museum, cut into pieces and sold. So this stealth material that made it all possible became a mechanism to support a museum and at the same time a souvenir of a moment in time. And I think both operations have been incredibly sophisticated and invisible and at the same time very clever at using resources and maintaining an investment in the public, make them a unique guest to us. So please welcome Anna and Marc. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Francisco, for this really generous introduction, and thank you really for the students to bringing us here. We are really glad to be here. It's our first time in Syracuse, so we are hopefully going to get to know some of you better. Today already we had a chance to talk with some students, and we had a small introduction today with one of our projects, unplanned introduction of one of our projects here. Tonight we are going to speak about 4 projects. You will see they all somehow connect from one to another. We will start with the research on Belgrade and then go to one project which has been a spatial intervention that we did in Rotterdam. And then we will move to these 2 biannuals, Venice biannual and the thing that we did for Tirana biannual last year. And maybe I don't have to say much now about our beginning or how we started, but here will be 3 quite old images actually from 1996, from an event that we co-organized, and I was at that time together with a group of friends, initiator of something that we called Project X. And Project X was an initiative actually by students of architecture in Belgrade in 1995. In the time when Serbia was under economic sanctions, isolated by the world, actually because a result of the war with Bosnia, Croatia, and many difficulties that were going on at that time. It was very claustrophobic and closed environment, and we really didn't want to be part of that xenophobic environment, and we wanted to open up somehow to the world, and we were, as these slides is very nervous somehow. And we were not satisfied with that situation. So we decided in year 1996 to organize an event under the title same like our group, Project X. And it happened in this factory, which you see in the background, and an abandoned sugar factory, which was decaying in the center of the city. And we brought about 200 foreign students of architecture, of arts, and about 40 tutors, people from different places all across Europe and United States as well, to work with us together for 10 days in this environment and actually somehow open up communication to the world. At the same time, Marc was, we did this, this was one of the first things that we did together, and at the same time, Marc was living at that time in Holland, and he was studying architecture at the School of Architecture in Delft. And they had some also similar, let's say, ideas about the environment in which they were, though very similar, very organized, quite well done, actually, architectural education. But on the other hand, also they were looking for some openings, opening up some more space actually for themselves. So they initiated also themselves educational programs within the school framework, and also were running a magazine which was called Turning Point, or the Omslag in Dutch. Why I'm saying all this is that this period and that time when we started to work together really quite influenced all the rest that happened afterwards. And I think it's quite, and we usually in the situations where we speak with students, we always say that we tried somehow to get things out of institutional framework, and this was very important for us at that time and is still important today. In the year 1998, we both graduated and we decided that we wanted to continue. We actually did our graduation project together, and we decided that we want to live and work together. And in 1998, we were looking for what would be that place for us. And Serbia was very difficult at that time, so I decided actually to move to the Netherlands and enroll at the Berlage Institute, where I did my master's program. But this moving to Netherlands brought us really actually to start to conceptualize somehow how we look at these two environments where we come from.
And very important for us was to use the tension between these two different environments. So the tension between Serbia and the tension between the Netherlands. In the Netherlands, which is a really very regulated, very planned, very designed country, at that moment we were, not we, but as a society we were in the stage of operating a huge program in which we were building 800,000 houses. It was called the VNEX program. And you see here how it basically looks. It was a program of mass individual housing. And that was different from what we had been doing before, which was much more collectively based housing. But times were changing and the whole market of housing was also developing. Before it was state subsidized. Now it became really a free market enterprise. So people were expecting much more individualistic approach, and this is the type of housing which we started to build. It's very repetitive. So this was also the critique to it. It was uniform, monofunctional, had a lack of public infrastructure. It was also dispersed throughout the country. And somehow it resulted in a call for what was called wild housing. So something which was more loosely planned, moving away from this massive uniform type of housing projects. Giving more freedom to inhabitants, which were more and more seen as emancipated citizens. But the thing is, Dutch can't deal with this wildness. So how does this emancipation look like? Well, it's basically the same as what we did before, maybe with some kind of slight aesthetic wild touches here and there. But this was the program, how it looked like. It was, again, it was mass individualistic housing.
Then we look at the same time what happened in the city of Belgrade. So this is Belgrade 1997, and what you see in this image, the focus of the image is on these two houses on top of these other houses. And actually the story goes, the two brothers decided to build these two houses. It's quite central in the city. Actually, when you're crossing one of the important bridges and you're coming into the center, you see was at that time one of the first things that you would see. And at that time, there were actually many, as maybe Francisco already mentioned, it was the time of crisis, time of actually dissolvement of state. And basically state, which was until the beginning of the 90s, providing for housing, for public transport, for many things, of course, which are, of course, necessary and normal in any city. But through socialist time, this was provided by the state, completely collapsed. So there was basically not provision for anything. And this was one of the results of that actually people were looking for a possibility to create their own living space in whatever situation they could do. And in this occasion, it ended up in these two houses, like rural houses sitting on top of another building. Many of these extensions on the roofs, infiltrations on the public space, occupation of publicly owned land actually didn't provoke so much reaction as these two houses. And why these two? Because of their aesthetics. And Architecture Society actually in 1997 wrote in a sort of a manifesto or appeal that this sort of practice should actually finish and that they're against it. But that was the only thing that actually they could do. They had no other means or no other, let's say, capacity to think about it in another way. So this is something that became very interesting for us and became a focus of our research for quite some period. Here we see 3 years later headlines like in one of the main newspapers saying, with the same two houses saying the largest title says Belgrade Wild City, and then it says that there is 95,419 registered informal or let's say illegal or not registered constructions in the city. What is interesting is that, or what is important to say, that this is how, let's say, these developments through the socialist time looked like, and this is year 1975. This is New Belgrade, one of the largest extensions of the city, new city actually with 300,000 inhabitants. When actually architects would build neighborhoods like this, there would be a small team of maybe 5 people working on a neighborhood of 60,000 people. In the 90s, this sort of practice completely disappeared, and it was not anymore, and it is not still anymore possible to do anything like this, and I think on the longer term there will be no projects like this possible. What happened at that time in the mid-90s is that actually because of all this lack of goods and stuff, people started to occupy public space and as well extend buildings, and what we in a joke called as that was a new Belgrade. We in joke call this what you see in front is people selling things on the street, the newest Belgrade actually. The one of that time that came uninvited somehow. And you see the title of our project actually was The Wild City, and then in subtitle Genetics of Uncontrolled Urban Processes. So we were interested in actually how did these things come to be there. And actually, the title of our project was the one which inspired the title in that newspaper article that you just saw before, because it appeared just one day after we presented our research project at the Faculty of Architecture in Belgrade and in the Belgrade Urban Planning Office. In the research Wild City, what we actually did, we mapped many of these phenomena, and what you see on this is a fragment of a city map where you see that this was really dotted interventions through, this is just the public things in public space, mainly related to street trade, like vendors, people selling on the street. But what happened is that through this process, things from very mobile became more and more stable and more solidified in space. While that figure in the article said that there was about 95,000 illegal buildings in the city of 2 million people, on the other hand, unofficial figures were saying that there are actually about 200,000, which means that 1 out of 10 people were actually intervening in the city in an unplanned and unregulated manner. How we saw this and what was happening, we actually realized that this is, in a way, sort of incubator, that we could observe the city which was passing through this enormous transformation as a sort of a laboratory, and that in this laboratory many interesting things are happening. There is a certain evolution also of the processes that we were observing, and we somehow saw ourselves as a sort of hunters in an urban jungle, where we would go into the world out there and try to understand actually or hunt these pieces, that what people are doing, and bring them somehow under the magnifying glass and look what they are. But what we decided also to do is not to do this by ourselves. There was 4 of us. There were 2 colleagues of ours, Milica Topalović and Ivan Kucina, with whom we did this together. And on top of that all, we decided to involve students from the Faculty of Architecture in Belgrade. So there were, in the first generation, 80 students actually mapping this phenomena together with us throughout the city. And this project continued in a couple of years later on. And actually, in the first year, we even didn't inform the school that we are going to do this project. They didn't know what was the subject of our studio and what we were doing, because we knew that they are not going to agree, because the school was completely not in the mood of understanding what is going on in this sort of reality, where actually they had not much to say, or what they would say is that they would actually draw plans of illegally built buildings afterwards. and give their stamp, and with that people would go to legalize. So that was the role of architects, let's say, at that point in time. So this catalog that we started to develop, what we call urban ready-mades, had a number of scales, things that we observed, and here you see in the bottom, let's say, on the things that were happening on the large scale. Of course, complete neighborhoods which were being developed on the edges of the city. As you see, these are not slums and not cardboard shacks, but this is informal housing. Another type of things, for instance, very extreme, also occupying kilometers of riverbanks with a number of activities from clubs, restaurants, facilities, elderly people meeting places, sport, even swimming pools, different sorts of things. To occupation of public space, where even city government contributed at some point by giving this shopping space in these modernist planned neighborhoods. And then we move across different scales, architectural typology, extensions of roofs, or organizational structures. And for instance, here we can see one of these extreme extensions of what actually ends here is the original building, and all what is built above it is an illegal extension, actually. So these 4 stories above are made just on top of the existing building. Here we see a stretch of a sidewalk which has been occupied first by temporary kiosks, then people started to make them more solid, and then in the end they added on top of that even living spaces. And one of the most interesting examples actually for us was not architectural, but was a story of public transport. Public transport, as it is in many, at least European cities, I don't know how it is here, is run by a city or companies which are related to the city. It was the same case in Belgrade, and during the 1990s, as everything more or less collapsed, the public transport as well collapsed. And then in an attempt to actually recreate this public transport, there were people first driving along bus lines, picking up others, then there were taxis doing the same, but at some point city decided actually to give permits to anyone who could obtain a bus and have a driving license to become a bus part of this system. So there were a number of individuals actually driving along these bus lines, and what is interesting is that this system actually survived and beyond the crisis and became a sort of a model where there is this hybrid organization, where there is still this original company and the number of small ones, so some of them died out and some of them became bigger in the meantime. What we were mostly interested was not aesthetics of all this process, but was what we called somehow genetics of them. And we even really literally played in our research with this idea that we are some sort of quasi-scientists and we are looking at what is going on. And in these diagrams, I will not go in detail, but they basically are steps of transformation of each of these processes that we observed. And maybe what is important to say is that you see in each of these diagrams there are 8 different processes, from public transport, flea market area, street trade, that there is certain interaction of what you see, these gray things and orange things. Gray are original institutions or original organizations that were there, and orange are new, infiltrated, informal, that became then formal through the time. And this hybrid was for us very interesting. Then we realized actually that across these processes there is a number of, let's say that there is a certain logic, that this is not really chaotic as everyone was telling, but that there is some sort of sequence of how these things happen. And that usually all of these things started with certain disequilibrium in the system that then through the time these new practices tried to claim either land or their own space, then that institutions would be reacting to that to in the end achieve some sort of solidification or evolution. Do you want to say something?
Or maybe to add something to this. It's very difficult for architects to somehow engage in such a flow, like of things happening in the city. And even if you map it out like that, it's hard to understand what you could do. But we got a hunch that it might be better, instead of trying to battle it, to trying to erase all these things which were going on in the city, to use the energy which is in it, because it's a massive energy. And if you somehow could bring it on your side, that would be very interesting. So this was also one way to map out the possible points where you could maybe tweak or influence such processes of urbanization. And this was something which we took with us and would maybe use later also in other projects.
So this was beginning of 2000s, at the point when we did this research. And what happened then is actually that the situation in a way changed, that the regime which was making Serbia isolated fell apart. Milosevic went to Den Haag, and a number of things happened, and everyone was hoping for some sort of normalization. And I would read here just a short text, how we saw that moment and what were we actually some way hoping for. However, the message of the wildness reaches much further than its appearance. For a period of 10 years, the wild city has created an unconventional social condition in contemporary Europe, a fairly primitive but rapid formation of a liberal market at its extreme, shows examples not determined by icons of global capitalism, but the romantically anarchist universe of ordinary people going for their everyday needs and dreams. On the city scale, this condition has pointed out to multitude, variety, dispersion, physical growth through decentralization, fragmentation, hierarchy, networked organizations. This reality of Belgrade allowed us for a while to imagine and speculate about public policy in which economies of scale and substantially less important than economies of variety and flexibility. The new and desired institutional structure is then created not to reverse, but to support emerging processes with a clear social agenda. The wild city evolved and sustained itself through economic, social, and political ruptures. It is an architectural creed. It offers no certainty and stable solution. It has no tolerance for professional prejudice. Instead, it allows us to enter the field of change of social and urban environment with ways to observe them and navigate them. And we will, in the end of our story, jump to now. So you will see what happened between that time and that hope that we had, where these processes could be taken with, let's say, democratization and normalization, and where the reality took us.
But what was very important from that project is that it influenced very much our thinking about architecture, and let's say our focus not on the aesthetic side, but more on the operational side, how things can unfold. These crazy diagrams which we saw from Belgrade with all these different steps, thinking how you could maybe influence the flow of certain things, also the power which is in which these processes from Belgrade had. So is it possible not to have to go against the flow of them, but maybe together in some kind of collaborative design effort to use such powers? This is something which stayed with us and which has been coming back in several of our projects. And I will show now one of the projects which we did in a completely different environment in Rotterdam in 2006, where some of these things are coming back. In 2006, we were asked by the Boijmans Museum, which is an arts museum in Rotterdam. It's the largest one, to help them set up a kind of interface space between the museum and the city. Like many museums in the world, they realized that they are living in a society which is fast changing. Different groups of people are coming into the city, that their conventional way of operating might not reach all these people anymore. and also that their relation with the producers of art could also be challenged, could be different. So they wanted to experiment with this, and they thought that opening a space, a physical space of their museum as an interface space would be one of the ways how to do it. And they chose this space for it, which they actually wanted to disconnect partly from the museum and give its own entrance so it could operate really on its own. And they wanted us to make a proposal, a first step, an initial step of how such an interface space could be imagined, could be worked out. And we understood that if we want to do something with a museum, want to change the way how this museum relates to the city, also want to change the way how the curators, so the people who are running the programs in this museum, relate to what they are doing, we have to shift the balance, the power balance which they have in that museum. So what we decided to do is to take this gallery space, which is about 660 square meters of space, and block it out with 2,000 cardboard panels. They are huge, they are more than man high, set on 15 centimeters, on such a distance. And we would fill out the whole museum space, filling that void, giving it volume, making it touchable, a structure of over 1,100 cubic meters. I don't know how much this tells to you, but it's like it's large, covering 400 square meters of this of floor space. So in the end, the space which we gave to the museum was this space. And together with the museum, we made a program of all kinds of activities which would come in to test that space and to test the possibilities of different types of programming in the museum. So here you see that what this grid of cardboard, which is a kind of architectural tool, what it did was to make the space, the size of the space, ambiguous. You had, when you would walk in, you had no idea anymore how large it is, or you had, the size somehow disappeared. Neutralizing part of its features, changing its perception, redirecting the movement which you had in that space. And all of that to contemplate what is the future, where next. That mass was there to be conquered and claimed by different artists. So we had about 25 different groups and people, artists, writers, journalists coming in, claiming their own piece of that space, negotiating with each other how to relate with each other in that space.
By literally cutting it out.
Yes, literally cutting it out, taking the knife, coming in on Monday, taking the knife, making your space. Of course, you had to deal with the neighbors, so that was very intense process. And for that, we gave a couple of simple principles which somehow relate back to these mechanisms which we found in Belgrade, these genetics, you could say. One of these guidelines which we gave to them is that there would be, each week there would be a certain amount of cardboard or space which would be available to be carved out. So volume of cardboard is released each week to provide the necessary spaces and facilities. And it was not possible to make a reservation. This program was running for 9 weeks, a 9 weeks period. Different people would come in at different moments during these 9 weeks. And when you would be in week 7 or week 6, you would come in on Monday, would just see what happened in the time before, and would start to make a plan based on that, negotiating with other people who would be doing something in that space during that time. And it was very important to do that because this blocked out completely the power of the museum over that space and the power of the curators, so the organizers of the program. And it challenged very much the way how this museum was working. So you see here the spaces as you find them, and shortly before your activity would take place, you would come in, you would start to negotiate, would start to carve out your space. There was no master plan, just working with what you found in the space. Interventions are irreversible, so you have to basically work with what is there, and if someone did something before you, you could maybe take over such spaces, transform them into something else, but you could not build it back into a full block. Allowed for very different things to happen simultaneous in that space. With and also without mutual agreement. So there were a lot of tensions, a lot of negotiations going on. What was possible, who would be where, what was going to happen. And here you see a couple of drawings which we made afterwards of how the space evolved. So we put in this grid and we started to talk with people. We didn't make plans of how this space should evolve during time and what would be the end result. The end result was the result of all the negotiations. So here you see, I will not tell what all these spaces are, but you get some idea of how it was carved out during these 9 weeks. And of course, this is a spatial prototype, a spatial experiment which is set within a very protected environment of a museum, of a cultural institution, ready to do something like that. With this project, we try to experiment with opening up a space which allows for a multitude of actions and interventions to happen. And also to give a space where initiative could be taken and which where you have to come in and decide what you want to do in that space, instead of that the museum or the museum organizers give that space to you. So this was, for us, it was a very nice step to start experimenting with how you can, in some kind of collaborative way, decide, test possible futures.
This project had informed what you will see next, but only in one of its aspects. It's in a spatial aspect. And as Francisco already said, we were in 2008 asked to curate Dutch Pavilion at the Architecture Biennial in Venice. But before going into that, actually, I would just like to picture a little bit context of this particular biennial and why it was interesting for us to do this. In 2008, the 11th Venice Architecture Biennial took place, and with the theme Out There, Architecture Beyond Building, curated by Aaron Betsky. It became clear that there is a sort of schism in architecture profession provoked by two extreme interpretations of the urgency of architecture today. That is something that you could feel there. And that is something that you could feel already in the preparations of this biennial. In the Italian pavilion, for instance, on one hand, we as well also participated as exhibitors in the exhibition among 55 practices, many of these societally engaged. And here, for instance, you see work of Raumlabor from Berlin. This exhibition used 1/10 of biennial budget. At the same time, there were some other interesting projects that were happening in Giardini, in the open space, where, for instance, Estonian pavilion installed this pipeline which was connecting German and Russian pavilion actually as a gas pipe, pointing to actual power relations of today. At the same time, the exhibition in the Arsenale, curated by Aaron Betsky, brought dozens of known architects and showed what he said, objects that make us feel at home, but at the same time they used the other 9/10 of the biennial budget, which was about €1 million. So this tension between what was going on in the Italian pavilion, where these, let's say, societally engaged, smaller scale practices were somehow engaged with the reality of today, And these sort of objects that were produced just for the purpose of this biannual, though beautiful but really questionable, where did all this money go, was something that we were interested in. On the 13th of May 2008, Faculty of Architecture in Delft burned down. This is school where Marc studied. Just a few weeks, 2 weeks actually later, we got invitation to curate a Dutch pavilion together with Saskia van Stein from the Netherlands Architecture Institute. The fact that this faculty in Delft burned down became focus actually of our concept and of our interpretation of what architecture beyond building is. This building was embodiment of modernism, and as we were a bit maybe today for the first years here explaining what Marc was explaining, this was an important school which was a result of 1968, this building was a result of 1968 student protest and was built as a result of this actually. When this building burned down, which was really an accident, there was a coffee machine that got on fire, there was a chain of incidents that happened, that there was no water in the building, there was a long weekend, that this water was dripping on this coffee machine, that the wind was blowing all the wrong directions, and in the end, as a result, you had this building totally burned down. After 2 months, there was actually even not this anymore, they razed it to ground completely. So, while the majority of discussion in the Netherlands at the time was about the new building, we saw that its disappearance provided a moment for rethinking the profession. So what we decided to do is to use the Dutch pavilion instead of a place for national representation of Dutch architectural achievements as an international platform and the knowledge production to collectively create an imaginary curriculum for the profession of architecture today. And we gave this project title Archiphoenix, obviously coming from the ashes of this faculty that burned down, and the subtitle Faculties for Architecture, not referring by it to the faculty as a facility, but rather speaking about faculties in terms of capacities, capabilities, and powers of architecture. We realized soon when we started to work on this project, and we actually started to work really late because we were invited 3 months before it started, that at the biannual there will be many practices present that already show possible directions of how architects can radically reconsider their tools, practices, and models of working, and that this was a perfect moment actually to speculate together. How could these practices, be made to work on a scale that answers the challenges ahead? So how something that is interesting on a small scale, are these practices actually capable to jump in scale? Is it possible to translate practices like Teddy Cruz, for instance, into a larger scale? Are these practices, can they just operate as a small scale, or are they transferable to something else? And these challenges ahead are, for instance, massive population growth, economic instabilities, limits of the resources available, just to name a few of the things ahead. And how we, let's say, frame the whole thing is that we discussed like what are for us beyonds, or what would be these capabilities of architecture beyond building. And we defined 5 topics or 5 questions that we were interested in. The first one was how we work, and we already somehow gave an answer to these questions. We were interested in the way of working beyond singular, beyond genius architect, beyond one creator, in a more collaborative way of working. The second topic was why we make. And maybe some of these questions we really don't ask ourselves anymore, and we really wanted to be basic and go back to that. And our beyond was beyond the profitable simplicity into social sustainability, interest going beyond pure economic drive for construction actually of architecture. Then for whom we make, or who are the new clients that architecture must address, and there we were interested in architecture going beyond power to empowerment. Who are these communities maybe that we are needed to? Why is architecture not addressing 90% of the world population? To what we make, and if we speak beyond building, then obviously we are speaking beyond the artifact, and what is that architecture can contribute there. And the last but not least, what it takes to make and unmake. And as a profession, we usually learn to make but not how to unmake the things that we produce. And therefore, beyond the sustainable, challenging the flow of resources, materials, and people. So we were interested actually going beyond the concept of sustainable, which is, if in essence, quite conservative, meaning preserving situation as it is today. Can't we do any better than that? So what we did, we opened this pavilion. It actually became an international platform. It didn't feature Dutch architecture, and we started with 6 days program that started before the official opening and overlapped it also with it, and we involved about 70 participants to fit into the framework of the 5 statements or questions which you saw just before. Each day it followed a different format, from an initial dinner for about 200 participants that launched the project, to round tables, speed dates, keynote speakers, marathon, and a workshop organized by students from Delft. And then to facilitate all of that, we actually have to figure out how to use this space. Maybe you would like to say a bit about the space.
Well, the first thing which we got when we went to Venice, to this pavilion, to take a look how it is, this space, what we could do there, was a very fat handbook of how to use the exhibition space. It's a space, a building which is made by Dutch architect Rietveld, a quite known architect, and it has become a sort of cultural monument, so it's protected. And the handbook also stated all of the things which were not allowed to do with the pavilion. So they had a massive amount of things which were not allowed to happen there. You couldn't touch the walls. It was not allowed to put things on the floor of dark color and all kind of things. And it's a bit weird, of course, for an exhibition space, because you think this is just an envelope to facilitate whatever comes into it. But it looked that we actually had to facilitate this building in being a magnificent heritage. So we understood quite early, we got also instructions of how to, with what soap to wash the flagpole and things like that. So it was a little bit weird. We decided rather than not to touch this building. If it's like that, we don't touch it. The other thing is that working in Venice gives you quite some logistic stress because there's very little to get in Venice, and everyone starts to run at the same moment to build up his own or her own pavilion. And when we were there, just right after we got this task to do it, and before the whole thing started to take off, we saw the enormous amounts of trash which were poured out by all these pavilions. Drywall, drywall, drywall everywhere, mountains, mountains of stuff. So we were thinking of how can we make actually something which will more or less disappear once we're gone, without much of trace. And something which we can bring from Holland to Italy, packed in a truck, unfold there, do our thing, fold back, drive away, and don't leave the trash there to Venice. So this is what we made. We made a setup, and I will explain you the trick with no trash a little bit later. We made a setup around a number of working islands which were to facilitate our program. So we had, for instance, a video editing space. We had an enormous stack of paper for a publication which we were going to make there. We had workspace for graphic editor. We had for magazine editors with whom we wanted to make a program there. And we had the stage for discussions and presentations. And all of this, which you see here, was packed in a huge block of plastic crates. And these were crates which you could collapse. So when you collapse them, they're only 1/3 of the height. And they were packed on the truck. We just unfolded them there, installed it. And we made this block with it. So this was basically the starting condition from which we started to work.
In this, as Marc was already saying, there were a number of these production islands, and this was, for instance, book editorial units, which already tells you that actually we wanted to make a book. In there, there was a space for a graphic designer, there was a stage and other things. And actually, so that was how it looked on the day one. On the day two, a program started by unpacking these units, and editorial team started to work. On the day three, the program started, so audience started to get in.
I forgot to tell one thing on the previous one. So we also used pallets. So the plastic boxes come on pallets in the truck. So basically we used all the elements which belong to that world of transportation to make the interior of this pavilion.
And basically this space would be transformed each day. There was also for that no plan how it would work, but we would in the end of each day evaluate actually what we need for the next, and then we would transform it. The first day of public program was 5 roundtable discussions, and everything actually was based on these 5 questions. So everything that was discussed would feed back into these topics that we set in the beginning. I will not speak who are the people, probably you recognize some of them. Then the space would transform to host the next day. For instance, here, Speed Date Marathon, which was running for 7 hours non-stop interviewing. So there were about 25 people that were interviewed on stage on their take on what would be faculties of architecture in the sense of capabilities, but also in terms of teaching at the faculties of architecture. And we had one really brilliant person who was non-stop interviewing people. Half of the program was determined who would speak there, and half was just I see Francisco and I call him on the stage, and then we have a discussion there. What was really interesting is what all these people were proposing, and there are 25 of these proposals, but you can see some of them, what people would be standing for, like faculty for content, faculty for subversion, faculty for relating, faculty for connective communication, faculty for surfacing doubt. And all these people, of course, had an argument why would they stand for something like that. On the day 5, we invited people outside of architectural profession to speak where they see capacities of architecture beyond building. And one of the speakers was John Takara, who is director of Doors of Perception, and we asked him to speak on the subject of beyond sustainability. And one of his statements was actually that in today's world there are more or less enough buildings, and that maybe architects should better concentrate on something else. And he advised actually that we as a profession are quite well in knowing processes, and this is our future. So this is view on someone who is outside of the profession, but let's say informed. So these were a number of views and takes on that. As I mentioned already, our intention was to produce a book through this intense period. So we engaged an editorial team on these 5 publications, and they worked really day and night, and as literally program was going on, they would be writing things. And book production with the graphic designer whom you see here sewing books literally while the thing is running. While everything would have been printed on site with a laser copier, and color pages were pre-printed before. There were about 10,000 copies made along the duration of the biannual. And the question is also, where did we see these issues actually before, and these 5 topics that we determined? Here, maybe you can say this part.
Now, what we realized when we started to look into these 5 topics, 5 questions, is that this was something which was, of course, 30 years before, was already very, very prominent in all kind of, let's say, radical experimental practices which have been working with these topics. So it was also for us, it was a kind of a reminder, like, okay, what did we do in all these 30 years? And the graphic designer with whom we worked, she thought it's very good to tease us with this, and she pre-printed part of the material which we had to use for the publication, in which she brought images from that time, so from the 60s, 70s, just to remind us that what we would be filling in on the other page had to be pretty good, you know, in order to stand up against that what was already, or stand out against that was already done before, 30 years before. What we do, so let's say the big trick in a way of our intervention was to not to start with an exhibition, but to use the whole period of the opening when so many people would be there and all these architects came to install their work, would be there for a couple of days and then would be basically hanging around. Our idea was to grab them, to bring them together and to make a program with them. And this worked well. This was a 1 week period, and after that we had like something like one and a half week of post-production in which we folded basically all the outcomes, all the material from these discussions into an exhibition which we set up in the pavilion.
But also all the material is available on this website where we archived all the talks, and the publications are available also as PDFs. And this is how it looked in the end.
And when the exhibition was over, we packed all the crates, we put them on these pallets, put it in the truck and drove off. And basically our only rests were the publications and the videos which we made.
And the crates were brought back to the factory from which it was bought and sold as a second hand.
So there's nothing left.
And this brings us to the last project and the Tirana biannual, which is completely different context than Venice. And with this we are going to take you actually to the beginning of the story. If you remember, story of Belgrade and wild constructions, wild building and informal settlements and things like that. Tirana biannual is one of the most important of the key art events in this part of Europe, in the Southeast Europe, or what some called Western Balkans. And it is taking place in Albania, a country which for about 40 years, from 50s to beginning of 90s, was one of the most harsh, self-isolated socialist regimes in Europe. A country from which you could not go out, but also you could not get in. In 2009, in its 4th edition, this biennial for the first time expanded in its scope to how cities develop today within the neoliberal context of fast capital investments, strong private initiative, and individually oriented society of Albania today. So we were asked within this art context to contribute on this topic of the transformation of Tirana and place it somehow in the context of the world of today. This event took place, it's a very interesting story, but maybe for another time, in an abandoned hotel right in the center of the city. And it had 3 episodes, so 3 parts, and we were doing one of these 3 parts. The hotel is abandoned since 2005, and in the meantime has been, some people have entered inside and completely stripped it and looted it in the last couple of years. So the state in which we found it was something like this, with only these chandeliers stayed from the previous condition. But let's just see a little bit what is context of Tirana today and 10 years after the Wild City project that we did in Belgrade. And maybe for that we will just fast forward and tell a little bit of each of these steps, how Tirana transformed. In the early 1990s, there has been an enormous flux of people, about 500,000 people, from the poorer, more rural areas moved into what was only 250,000 people city. So from 250,000, it grew today to 850,000 in just about 15 years. And they squatted publicly owned agricultural land around the city. This is how it looks today, but more or less that is how it looked also 10 or 15 years ago. Just these were much closer to the city center.
Just imagine people from outside of Tirana, the capital of that country, they were not allowed to enter the city. So in the beginning of the 90s, like in Yugoslavia, their state disappeared. You know, they had a socialist, actually a communist regime, this stopped one day, and then the next day you wake up and you have a country which is completely different. So you have no government anymore. You have to invent what is going to be your next economy, from something which is completely state-run into something which you don't know. So those people, they had only one idea: run to the capital, because that is the place where they expected some sort of economy to be. So 500,000 people came in that way.
And most of the construction has been built in this informal but solid way. At the same time, there were many abandoned facilities like factories, which are either looted or also stripped or sold and privatized. But then in the year 2000, Edi Rama, an artist and politician, became mayor of Tirana, and here you see him up there. The city without budget, low appreciation of municipal authority, city with a huge influx of people, degraded social relations. His first and most known project in the early 2000s started with painting facades of buildings from the socialist period which were in the state of total disrepair. Though simple and at the first glance a decorative action, this low-budget intervention managed to bond people, restore certain belief in municipal authorities, and shifted the mood in the city to a more optimistic one. Though Edi Rama and this project, through Edi Rama and this project, actually Tirana got known abroad, and he got in 2004 an award for World Mayor. On this image, you see 4 projects which were made a couple of years later. So these were not the first project, but these are facade projects made by some of the most known artists of today, like Olafur Eliasson up there, or Rikrit Tiravanijo down there, and Edi Rama himself on the top right, because he is also a painter himself. At the same time, the most noted impact of Rama has been the many demolitions of illegally built and constructed objects in the city center. So this is also here, beginning of 2000s. And this is how this operation looks. On the left, you see there is this tiny river called River Lana, and there are many buildings around it, what they called kiosks, but these were not kiosks. These were really solid buildings with shops and living spaces on top, restaurants, cafes. And this was in the beginning very unpopular, but actually became later on very popular action, and people really liked the fact that this was demolished and it was turned into this. This cleanup and the reclaiming of actually public land only happened in the city center, so it didn't happen in other areas of the city. A few years later, following the first international competition in 2004, the Tirana city center master plan was drawn by the French architecture studio. The main aim of this project, as they say, is to preserve the city's historic heritage and to combine high-quality architecture with carefully and modern renovated historic buildings. This plan was very ambitious, and obviously in an environment like Tirana, it was really landing like a space shuttle. It was really hard to imagine that something like this would really happen. And these are some of the images of what was this plan offering, and among projects were 20 high rises, 5 of them remarkably 85 meters high buildings that would be erected in the center. Actually, by now, only one of these towers is under construction, and hardly anything else of this plan has been realized. Then, also on initiative of Edi Rama, as this master plan was also part of his initiative, in 2003 they started with a number of international architecture competitions, but these competitions all favored known foreign architects. So the model of the competition would be 4 known foreign architects plus 1 local architect competing on a specific site. Never any of local architects won any of these competitions. And here you see some of the results. That on the left up there is project of young Belgian office, actually 51N4E, and they are realizing this only tower, and it is only because of their personal engagement and really drive to make this project happen. Here on the lower end is MVRDV project, which was called Tirana Rocks, very controversial project which in Tirana provoked a lot of discussion and meant to be located in a privatized public park. Apart from the main square, all the projects have been made for private investors, so there is no any public commission, actually. While there was all these interesting, though debatable things going on in the city center, and here you see the master plan insertion in the rest of Tirana. As a result of restrictions set for the city center by the master plan, the pressure for real estate development jumped at the areas outside of the center. This was the only regulated part where you have really to fight hard and get all the permissions and go through competitions to realize something. Outside of it, there was no any control. So that left the center in very slow pace of transformation, and this is what has been going on the, just outside of it or on the edges of the city. New development started taking place elsewhere, and while buildings in these areas were in the beginning, like 15 or 10 years ago, of a modest scale, now they jumped up in scale dramatically. During the last years, Albania's strongest economy has been the construction economy, but the crash of real estate market is also having its effects here, leaving many apartments unsold. At the same time, older parts of the city are absorbed by large-scale development, so what actually happens is that this person would give to a developer the plot, they would demolish this house and make such a high-rise in which they would get 2 apartments and 50 new neighbors. Also, quality of urban space deteriorated and almost all green areas have been eaten. Then, unavoidably, there is also coming of shopping malls, and there are hundreds and thousands of square meters of shopping malls being developed, not just in Albania, but in the entire region. But little is anticipated what will current economic crisis and even more the crisis of the mall as a concept mean to the future urban structure for cities like Tirana, for instance, having in mind about 4,000 dead malls in the United States alone. So all this, what is going on today with Tirana was a base for what we did, and I don't know how much time we have, but we have one, let's say, stampedo overview of what has been going on in the region with a number of local initiatives that are appearing in the meantime, and I don't know if we should run through it. And in the end, we have a few examples of projects that we think are relevant for Tirana of today. Okay, to jump to that end, okay. Just need a little bit of time. So, in the context of biannual, there were many different things that we did and that happened at workshop with students, discussions with people, like Francisco was also there, number of people from the region. But what we actually wanted to offer somehow, or wanted to provide to this context is to speculate what is to come next. It looks like Tirana finds itself at a turning point, a point from where building regulations will turn more strict, and moment of global economic crisis, but also a local saturation because of which the construction business will not any longer be the country's main industry. Actually, 80% of the economy in the last years was coming from real estate and construction business. A point from which investors may turn into developers that take care for what they make, beyond the point of selling, a point where painting facades and exclusive international competitions reach their limits, but also a moment when local governments will start gaining budgets, since people will more regularly pay taxes, and the city will gain possibilities to initiate public commissions, for instance for schools, but we'll have to search for available land to do this, as there is no available land anymore. So in a part of an exhibition that we did, there was this corridor with 11 rooms. What we did is that on the right side, we tried to picture the issues which are present in Tirana itself by showing how they look in other contexts. And on the other side of the corridor, we somehow try to offer inspiration to how to get prepared for this reality that we would hope for. Would you take? No.
One of the first works which so it was a mix of works by architects, works by artists, by NGOs, and one of the first things which we have been showing is a work called Our Building. And what is interesting about it is that it tries to re-establish kind of neighborhood committees which before in Yugoslavia were existing in these large housing blocks. These housing blocks, they have nowadays been privatized without thinking of how do you deal actually with that what you have in common, because you have still a structure to maintain. There is a roof, you have an elevator, you have the whole thing. But because these blocks have been split in individual units without facilitating some kind of platform of how to deal with the maintenance, one artist started to reinstall these neighborhood committees, and he did it in a very interesting way. He became president of such a neighborhood committee. It's actually a house committee, and he made a radio program about it, because there are literally thousands and thousands of such type of buildings throughout whole Eastern Europe and throughout former Yugoslavia. He thought it's very interesting if you make a slightly anonymized radio talk about life in such a building, about the things which people have in common, the problems which they have, and the way how they would address possible solutions. So each week he would make on the radio 3 minutes of talks which he had with his neighbor, with his neighbors and their neighborhood committee. And this would be broadcasted throughout the city. No one knew which block it was, which neighborhood it was, but it was for a lot of people. It was very recognizable, and somehow sparked again some kind of motivation to set up such structures, such collective structures. Here you see one of the conversations which they had, but let's not go into that. Another practice which we wanted to show in the context of Tirana was Teddy Cruz, especially because of his idea of redefining ownership, redefining land ownership, redefining the plot sizes, and this is, oops. This is how one of his projects looks, in which he is actually trying to get to smaller plot size. Or combinations of different plot sizes in order to make kind of collective investments possible. Collective investments which are something which are not at all imaginable at this time in Tirana. So we thought maybe by bringing this from the United States and show it in Tirana, we could slowly turn their way of thinking in how to regulate the future plots and land divisions in their city. We showed the project of Elemental from Chile, which is a very interesting project because it's a clever economic model of how to make housing in poor areas. And this was in which area it was? Yes, it was a project where for a couple of, I think $7,000 they made the houses. $7,000 per individual unit. They made kind of social housing, and the base of that was a very simple and elegant mathematical equation. And we thought it's interesting to show this as one of the ways how you can run your practice. You don't always have to make maybe the most excellent design. Maybe it's also good to make an excellent economic model to address certain social issues. But on the other hand, we thought it's a very clever idea of how to show how you could bring to very poor or very well, very poor areas, how to bring a certain standard of architecture. Another work which we showed is by an NGO from Tirana, which is called Co-Plan. And they started a couple of years ago by working in these neighborhoods which had been, let's say, informally grown. It's of course not informal because they all have form, but what we call informal. And they tried to bring the most basic infrastructure. So sewage, water, roads, negotiating their way through these neighborhoods, because sometimes you have to move walls, sometimes you have to move parts of houses to make this possible. And they developed a very interesting practice doing this, in a way very advanced in that region. It's from '95 when they started to work on this. By now they established also their own university, because they understood that their way of looking at urban planning, urban management, was something which was not being picked up by the state university, because the state university was purely focusing on architecture in making, you know, the great excellent designs, but was not able to relate to the world, the city outside there. They tried to change something in that faculty of architecture there, but they couldn't. And then they decided to make their own faculty of architecture. And this is one of the few schools in that whole region which focuses almost exclusively on urban management. They have an architecture department, but actually their whole focus is on urban management, not urban design.
By now, this same organization actually is 20 full-time, has 20 full-time time employees, but is still an NGO, so the one who started this university. And they today work closely with local and central government institutions, as well as civil society groups, with a strong focus on influencing policy making. So you see that even in the context like Tirana, from that like groundwork, working really in these neighborhoods, breaking the street, going kilometer by kilometer and making asphalt, they in just 15 years actually reached the point that they started up their own university and are at this level to influence policy.
One of the last works which we will show here, which we will speak about, is from Medellin. What we thought was very interesting in the city of Medellin in Colombia, and I guess you will have heard about this through Francisco, is that the mayor the mayor was able in a very short time with a dedicated team of people to use architecture as a tool to achieve certain social cohesion. And we thought it's super interesting, because normally what you will not expect is that, let's say, public facilities, but really great public facilities, are being brought to neighborhoods which are generally not regarded by city authorities as key investment points. But in this city it has been done. And we thought it's very important to speak about this in the context of Tirana. In Tirana, the most, let's say, magnificent examples of architecture, and I think this is a public library, which we see on here. Let's say the most magnificent architecture was focused in this small area right in the city center. Was almost exclusively private development. There has been hardly any public commission except for one city square. But all energy was focused on these private developments of business towers right in the center. And we know that it's such a small part of the city, so there is this vast amount of urbanization taking place around that, which is not being addressed. And we have a mayor there, which is painting facades, cleaning up here a little bit and there a little bit, and doing these competitions. And we thought it's very important to speak in Tirana about this possibility, maybe to do in such neighborhoods which are outside of the center, which have been wildly growing in the last years, to bring public commissions, to bring public facilities, because there is no one else who will ever do that if you don't do it. Well, we hope this offers a glimpse of the different possibilities which you could imagine for a city like Tirana. But of course, what reality will bring is up to us, and I hope we are smart enough to invent new practices which are continuing on these things which we've seen here, because these are, let's say, these are the starts of what we could imagine, but they will be not enough to address all these issues which you meet in a city like Tirana, in a city like Belgrade. But those cities are very, very vital, very vibrant laboratories for finding out new models of urbanization, new models how to deal with cities. So this is what we wanted to share here with you. Thanks.
Okay, so we have a little time for questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the mic.
Yes.
So you offered a lot of ideas about kind of alternative practices or different ways that we can look at architecture and its influence and its roles and its place in society. Is this, I mean, do you see like what you're trying to do, are these potentials really about facilitating alternatives, or is this something more widespread that really changing the practice really wholesale, rather than maybe, again, little bits here and there that are now more enabled through what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I think the issue is about, in the end, it's about a redefinition of what our practice is about. This was basically also the let's say the foundation of this this approach or this set of topics which we had in Venice in the biannual, because you can really wonder what it is, what our profession can do. You know, is it really a big trick after thousands of years that we are still stacking concrete, bricks, and steel on top of each other? Is that really what we can offer? Or in today's world, with the challenges which we all know are there ahead, should we do other things? There is no, at least from our side, there is no simple answer to this, what that exactly should be. But it's for sure we believe that there should be a redefinition of our practice. Also, I think that in a world which is more and more going towards immaterial production, somehow our own profession is, stays way behind. It's very heavy. It's not at all flexible. It's not at all able to easily address all kind of changing parameters in our environment. Not only the built environment, the economy, social relations, demographic changes. It's very heavy practice. So I think these things should change. And this, what we are now able to show, are maybe some inspiring examples of good things happening here and there.
And there are many more.
Yeah, and of course there are many more, but I don't think that they're yet there to make such a shift happen, and that is something which we should be looking forward to.
Actually, with this last story of why we were interested in bringing Madeleine's story and also bringing Francisco to tell this story in Tirana, was that we really think that it is nice that there are NGOs, so smaller groups like this guy who set up the community in the building, and universities that are dealing with things, but actually politicians are the ones that really have to step forward. And that story of Madeleine was interesting for us for that reason. And in the case of Tirana, that is what we think should happen next. This university is really pretty advanced, for instance, for the context in which it is, and actually for any context is pretty advanced. But I think that politicians are the ones who really have to make next step and to understand what they can potentially really bring to society of today. without that, I think we as a professional hardly going to, I mean, we will stay small scale if that doesn't happen.
I have a quick question. Building on that, is space or the production of space one of the potentially persistent threads? You're talking about an immaterial focus, and I'm struck by the two exhibitions which use either the plastic containers or the cardboard and the kind of agency of charged voids in a fairly conventional sense, immaterial but still kind of spatial intervention. Could you say something about that?
I think that these two exhibitions or contexts which you saw, they didn't really try to get immaterial. It's maybe the most efficient way of using the materials which you have at hand. But true is that, I'd say the base of our way of thinking is space and the agency of space. So when we are speaking about architectural production or production of built environment, it's much more, for us, it's much more interesting to look at, let's say, generation of, to generate space than exactly the materialization of that, how that takes place. I don't know, do I answer your question with this?
Yeah. I mean, is it a kind of Henri Lefebvre idea, in a sense, that the production of space has a certain kind of political agency and that who is developing or constructing that space is the primary issue, in a sense? That there's a freedom in the construction of space?
Yes, it's in the end, it's about ownership, accessibility, and configuration of that, absolutely.
Also in this story of Belgrade in the beginning, that's what we saw actually in the effect. We were interested in actually all these people making that space. I mean, that was one of our main interests. It was in some way that democratization, even it was illegal, but in some way it was democratization of that creation of space, which is pretty limited today. I mean, there are just a few people, I mean, architects and politicians, few planners, and those that are investing bigger amounts of money, they have say, and the rest is not able to do that.
Hello. In several of your projects, you basically developed a framework within your exhibitions that allowed others to personalize them further. And I was wondering, basically, can you speak a little about the importance of this participation design within like the community building and the community claiming the spaces themselves?
It's important. I mean, it's obviously was the base of that project, Cut for Purpose. I mean, that was our main, let's say, drive. We didn't openly speak about it wherever we went, you know, to the people that participated in the project. But somehow setting up that, what one of our colleagues called, how did he call it? How did Peter call it? Common operational field. Common operational field. This material really actually provided that engagement for everyone on somehow on an equal level. And they all had to deal with this, so they had to communicate, and that participation and that communication about the space was as important as the events that actually happened within it. There were many also interesting things that really happened. We didn't go into program. Some people made films in it. Some people there were residency programs. Where artists spent like 3 weeks working within the space. A writer spent 10 days. So there was a sort of small community really living in it.
I really enjoyed, say, the political implications of what you're talking about and the type of work that you're showing. And it seems that it advocates for a real kind of political engagement with, say, power structures in a very strategic way. And I'm curious about the way you practice and how you are able or choose to interface within these political entities, so be it planning or zoning or infrastructural development. And I'm wondering as your practice evolves, how do you imagine or want to interface with these entities who really seem to have far more power within the built environment as it currently stands?
Can you say something about the Constitution? Well, this is our practice. I mean, this is also our practice. But if you mean in the sense of more conventional architectural design or planning, or well, we did some other projects which we didn't show here. We did, for instance, one research which was made in the city of Amsterdam, specifically for the north part of Amsterdam. This was a, let's say, large-scale, in a way, strategic planning project, and where we looked at the development trajectory of 25 years for this area, where the city made a master plan for the area where and how, and even in which sequence they would fill in these formal industrial areas with housing, with offices and different facilities. And what we did together with the municipality in that project was that we discussed with them, they invited us actually to look at the temporary side of that development, so that we looked at the period before all these things get realized. And actually there is a big chance that many of these things will never get realized as they were planned 25 years before. So we made together with them actually sort of a shadow master plan, and that shadow master plan was meant to somehow propose what can happen in that interim period between stopping of certain functions or while the lands are still empty and before the construction comes. So that is one of the projects which was really on a larger scale, working with politicians basically and people that are managing these sort of large-scale projects.
I was just trying to think what to answer to this. I think if you look at some kind of maybe pattern or model which is appearing, I think we often give the wrong answer to, on purpose, or the unexpected answer to certain commissioners or, for instance, in this case, municipal authorities. I mean, not wrong that it's a bad answer, but I think we have a bit of a tendency to turn the question around and to start to play with them, and then together maybe to find out where you could go. Like for instance, now there is this, there is the whole hype of because also the economy crashed down. There's a whole hype about interim uses of space.
At least in the Netherlands.
In the Netherlands, but also in London, in Berlin, in different places. And during the last 10 years, we've been seeing all kind of books, fancy books and stuff like that coming out of this. And what we were last year, we were invited in one of these temporary use projects to do workshops and stuff like that. And we actually got a little bit, we felt very uncomfortable with this, you know, to add to this pile of nice books, to, you know, most of these projects are somehow kind of cover-up operations for other things which are going on. Like how do I, in a period when my real estate portfolio is standing empty and waiting, how do I somehow give it a nice touch, or how do I maybe raise even with the help of some artists the value of certain property. So we decided to make this constitution of the meantime, in which we tried to give a couple of guidelines of how you can use this interim period, what kind of coalitions you could set up for this. And of course, you know, the rules of how you deal with each other. And one of the rules was that we recommended that instead of what usually happens afterwards, that at some point the party is over, and then we have one group of people who go very happy home, and another group of people who start to cry because somehow they lost a lot of their potential, they invested a lot of their energy. we recommended that before they start to do anything, they sit together, they discuss how, at the end of the trajectory, you divide this, what you built up together. How do you do this? And what kind of exchange rate and what kind of currency do you imagine for that? It can be anything. It can be time, which you can get in exchange, maybe somewhere else. Or it can be also money, part of your investment you get back. So a couple of these things we actually recommended, and we gave back to the organization which asked us to, you know, to make another nice, cute proposal. And this actually, in the context of the Netherlands, started to work pretty well because it provoked quite some discussion. There are a lot of these projects going on, and of course we were being beaten by everyone because the groups who are usually using this interim period, they said, but you can't regulate the last bit of the city which is still open and which is not regulated. And the developers, they would say, but you can't speak about this economic side of it, because once you touch that, it will not work anymore. But I think exactly by touching this, you know, this game which is being played there, which is actually very uneasy, because most of the temporary users are not at all looking for a temporary solution, but basically they have nothing else to go for. You know, by taking that apart, I think that was some, you know, a way of how to interface, you know, and giving this back. So okay, now you fight with it. And also in the case of Boymans, this museum, of course, didn't expect us to block out their space and to give them a hell of a time with a lot of negotiations going on. The result of that process was also that their initial idea of making this interface space, that they dropped it because they realized that if they really want to engage with different groups on let's say on an almost daily basis, it's not something such a museum can do. So now instead, if they want to be in some kind of interface position, they go out of the museum and they look for a third space where they can do certain things.
Do you want to say something?
Well, we'd like to thank everyone for coming, Anna and Marc for giving us this lecture, and of course the School of Architecture for helping us out in bringing you guys here, Professor Yoder, Professor Sanine, and the rest of the SMAD members. We hope you all enjoyed this lecture, and thanks again.
And I would like to give to you the book from VEMS that we produced in the pavilion, and this is the newspaper from Tirana.
Thank you so much.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you.